March 2007. A monstrous sandstorm swallows southern Afghanistan. Visibility drops to zero. Wind rips at 90 kilometers per hour. Every American commander makes the same call. Stand down. Ground all aircraft. Nobody moves. But 6 vehicles are already tearing through that wall of brown chaos. No headlights. No radio contact. Just bearded men who look more like apocalyptic raiders than soldiers. And they are hunting a Taliban convoy that thinks the storm makes them invisible. What happened next sent shockwaves through enemy command structures for years. The Taliban started calling them the devils who ride the wind. And there is a very dark reason why. You think you know special forces? You have seen the Hollywood version, the clean uniforms, the high-tech gadgets, the choreographed operations with helicopters and air support. Forget all of that, because the Australian SAS played by completely different rules. Rules that made American SEALs uncomfortable. Rules that made Delta Force operators question everything they had been taught. Rules that worked terrifyingly well until they stopped working at all. Why did these men cut the doors off their vehicles when everyone else was adding more armor? Why did they clear buildings in total silence while Americans used flashbangs and shouted commands? And why did a captured Taliban commander admit that his fighters would engage American patrols with confidence, but refuse to go anywhere near the bearded Australians? The answers will disturb you, because this story does not have a clean ending. The same qualities that made these operators the most feared hunters in Afghanistan also led to something much darker, something that eventually forced an entire nation to confront a question nobody wanted to ask. What happens when you build the perfect weapon and then lose control of it? Stay until the end. Because the final revelation about what really happened in those Afghan valleys will change how you think about modern warfare forever. The satellite imagery showed nothing but a wall of brown chaos stretching from the Pakistani border to the outskirts of Kandahar. Every American commander on Bagram airfield stared at the same weather report and made the same decision. Stand down, ground all aircraft, recall all patrols. The Haboob rolling across southern Afghanistan in March of 2007 was classified as a Category 4 dust event with visibility reduced to less than 50 meters, wind gusts exceeding 90 kilometers per hour, and enough particulate matter in the air to choke a diesel engine within minutes. No sane military planner would authorize operations in those conditions. But sanity was never the Australian way. Somewhere in the howling darkness of that storm, 6 long-range patrol vehicles were already moving. No headlights, no radio chatter, just the growl of modified engines and the crunch of sand against metal as the vehicles pushed deeper into the maelstrom. The men inside wore goggles caked with grit and scarves wrapped around faces that had not seen razors in months. They looked less like soldiers and more like apocalyptic raiders from a fever dream. Intelligence had confirmed that a Taliban supply convoy was using the Sandstorm as cover to move weapons and fighters from Pakistan into Uruzgan province. The enemy commanders had made a reasonable calculation that no Western forces would be foolish enough to operate in conditions that could strip paint from steel. They had forgotten about the Australians, and what the Australians were about to do would send shockwaves through Taliban command structures for years to come. The Special Air Service Regiment had spent 5 years learning that Afghanistan rewarded audacity and punished hesitation. They had watched American units follow protocols that made sense in PowerPoint presentations and got men eliminated in the valleys of Helmand. They had seen British forces advance by the book and retreat by the body bag. The Australians had drawn a different conclusion from the same data. The rules were written by people who had never tasted the dust. The dust itself was the only ally worth trusting. The origins of Australian Special Operations Doctrine traced back to the jungles of Borneo and the deserts of North Africa, but the version that emerged in Afghanistan was something entirely new. The American approach relied on overwhelming technological superiority with drone surveillance, satellite communications, precision-guided munitions, and armored vehicles designed to survive improvised explosive devices. The Australian approach relied on a simpler principle: become so dangerous that the enemy fears the ground itself. But technology versus instinct was only the surface difference. The real gap ran much deeper. The contrasts were visible the moment you stepped onto a shared forward operating base. American special operators arrived in pristine tactical gear with plate carriers loaded with the latest equipment and weapons adorned with optics that cost more than a family sedan. They moved in choreographed formations, communicated through encrypted radio networks, and planned operations with the precision of corporate executives scheduling quarterly earnings calls. The Australians looked like they had crawled out of a time machine set to some alternate reality where the apocalypse had already happened. Their uniforms were faded, torn, and stained with substances that defied identification. Their beards extended past their collarbones. Their vehicles were stripped-down Land Rovers with no doors, no roofs, and enough firepower mounted on the frames to level a small village. They communicated through hand signals and meaningful glances. American commanders initially questioned whether these were actually elite soldiers or some elaborate joke. The answer came during joint operations that left even the most experienced U.S. operators struggling to process what they had witnessed. And one particular incident would become legendary among coalition special forces. A Navy SEAL team leader who participated in combined missions during the 2008 rotation described his first encounter with Australian tactics in terms that bordered on disbelief. He had expected professional soldiers. He had received something closer to predators in human form. The specific incident occurred during a compound clearance in the Kora Valley. The Americans had established a perimeter, coordinated with air support, and prepared to execute a textbook breach. The Australians simply walked toward the target building as if they were going to check the mail. No stack formation, no flash grenades staged, no countdown on the radio. They moved through the door, and the Americans heard nothing for approximately 4 minutes. When the SEAL team leader entered to provide backup, he found the Australians sitting among 6 neutralized enemy fighters, casually going through documents as if sorting office paperwork. The entire clearance had been conducted in near total silence. The Americans had not heard shots because the Australians had used suppressed weapons with such precision that the reports blended into ambient night noise. This was not luck. This was not a fluke. This was years of doctrine refined through blood. The philosophy behind Australian silent operations evolved from lessons learned in Vietnam, where the SASR discovered that noise was the primary enemy of survival. American units in that conflict had relied on volume with artillery barrages, helicopter gunships, and overwhelming firepower that announced their presence across entire provinces. The Australians had operated differently. They moved through jungle like ghosts, conducted reconnaissance patrols lasting weeks without a single radio transmission, and developed communication systems based entirely on physical signals and pre-established protocols. Afghanistan presented different terrain but the same fundamental problem. Sound carried across valleys with alarming clarity. A single shouted command could alert enemy positions kilometers away. The crack of an unsuppressed rifle announced not just location, but intentions. The Taliban had learned to listen for Americans and could identify incoming operations by the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors and chatter of radio traffic. The Australians gave them nothing to hear. Their compound clearance technique operated on a principle called flow state. Each operator knew exactly where every other operator would be at any given moment. They moved through structures like water through pipes, filling spaces without collision, covering angles without verbal coordination. The training required to achieve this synchronization was measured in years. The results were measured in enemy fighters who never knew the end had arrived. But silent operations were only one element of the Australian advantage. Their vehicles told an equally compelling story. The American approach to tactical mobility centered on protection. The improvised explosive device threat had reshaped U.S. military procurement, resulting in massive armored vehicles like the MRAP weighing upwards of 14,000 kilograms and offering crews protection against significant blast events. The logic was sound on paper. Soldiers inside these vehicles survived explosions that would have destroyed lighter platforms. The Australians looked at the same threat and reached the opposite conclusion. Their long-range patrol vehicles were based on six-wheel drive Land Rover platforms stripped of everything unnecessary. No doors meant faster egress during ambushes. No roof meant better situational awareness and faster weapon deployment. No armor meant vehicles weighing less than 4,000 kilograms that could achieve speeds the MRAPs could only dream of reaching. The philosophy was brutally simple. You cannot be targeted by an IED if you move too fast for the triggerman to react. You cannot be pinned in an ambush if you drive through it before the enemy coordinates fire. You cannot be trapped in a kill zone if your vehicle travels where the enemy never expected any platform to survive. What the Americans witnessed next would haunt them for the rest of their careers. American observers described watching Australian patrols with a mixture of horror and admiration. The vehicles would tear across terrain that should have been impassable, kicking up rooster tails of dust, operators standing exposed behind mounted weapons with nothing between them and enemy fire except speed and aggression. It looked suicidal. It worked. The Taliban had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat American armored columns. They would emplace IEDs along predictable routes, set up ambush positions with interlocking fields of fire, and wait for slow-moving MRAPs to enter kill zones. These tactics were worse than useless against the Australians. The vehicles moved too fast to target effectively. They did not follow predictable routes because they did not follow routes at all. They simply drove toward objectives across whatever terrain presented itself. And when ambushes did occur, the Australians did something that defied every instinct drilled into Western soldiers. They attacked. The engagement that became legendary among coalition special operations forces occurred in Uruzgan province during spring of 2009. An Australian patrol of 4 vehicles was moving through a valley flagged as high risk for ambush activity. The warning proved accurate. Approximately 2 kilometers into the valley, the lead vehicle came under fire from 3 separate positions on the ridgeline above. Standard doctrine for any Western military force called for immediate halt, suppressive fire, and rapid calls for air support. The Americans would have dismounted, established cover, and coordinated methodical response through radio networks. The British would have done approximately the same with different accents. The Australians accelerated. The patrol leader made an instant calculation that would have been considered reckless by any conventional standard. The ambush positions were established to engage targets at expected speeds. By increasing velocity and driving directly toward the nearest enemy position, the Australians would enter a zone where ambushers had not pre-registered their weapons. What happened in the next 90 seconds rewrote the tactical playbook for a generation of operators. The 4 vehicles split into 2 pairs. The first pair drove straight up the slope toward the primary ambush position with mounted weapons blazing in continuous streams of suppressive fire. The second pair flanked wide using a dry riverbed the enemy had not considered a viable approach route. Within 90 seconds, the ambush became a rout. Taliban fighters found themselves under fire from directions they had not anticipated, unable to adjust positions fast enough to track vehicles already past them. The engagement ended with 11 enemy fighters neutralized and 0 Australian casualties. The entire event lasted less than 4 minutes. When American liaison officers reviewed the after-action report, their primary question was how the Australians had coordinated such complex maneuvers without any radio communication during the engagement. The answer was simultaneously simple and impossibly difficult. They had trained together for so long that communication was unnecessary. Each driver and gunner knew what others would do, because they had done it together hundreds of times. The Australians did not fight as individuals coordinating through technology. They fought as a single organism with multiple bodies, but this seamless lethality came with a price tag that would not come due for years. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment conducted continuous rotations through Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021. Some operators deployed 10 or more times. Some spent more cumulative time in combat than any special operations forces in Western history since the Second World War. And the war they fought was not the clean surgical conflict that politicians described in press conferences. The Taliban enemy did not wear uniforms. They hid among civilian populations. They used women and children as shields. They booby-trapped bodies and buildings. They employed deception at every level with fake surrenders that became ambushes, intelligence sources who were actually enemy agents, and villagers who smiled during daylight and planted explosives at night. The frustration among SASR operators built through year after year of rotations. They would capture enemy fighters who would be released within months through legal systems that seemed designed to protect the guilty. They would neutralize Taliban commanders only to see replacements emerge within weeks. They would clear villages that returned to enemy control the moment they departed. Something fundamental was breaking inside the men who endured this cycle long enough. American special operators who worked alongside the Australians in later years noticed a difference in men who had been deploying since the early days. There was a hardness in their eyes that went beyond combat experience, a flatness in their voices suggesting emotions had been filed away somewhere inaccessible, a willingness to operate in gray zones that made even hardened SEALs uncomfortable. The same independence that made them devastating also meant fewer eyes watching what happened in the darkness between operations. The specific incidents that would later become subjects of investigations were symptoms of deeper transformation. Men exposed to unlimited violence in conditions of unlimited frustration had developed survival mechanisms that worked in combat but corroded everything else. They had become the weapons they were trained to be. But weapons have no conscience, no hesitation, no mercy. This was the dark bargain of the Australian approach. The factors that made them devastatingly effective were the same factors that created conditions where terrible things could flourish without check. Now back to that Sandstorm. Back to 6 vehicles pushing through conditions that should have stopped any military operation. The patrol had been tracking the Taliban convoy through dust so thick that operators could barely see the vehicle ahead of them. Navigation was conducted through GPS and dead reckoning, a combination requiring absolute confidence in equipment and instinct. The wind howled at velocities that would have grounded any aircraft and stopped any conventional patrol. The Australians pressed forward because they understood something the enemy did not. The convoy would be moving slowly, conserving fuel and protecting cargo. The Australians would be moving fast, using the storm as concealment rather than obstacle. The intercept point was calculated based on road conditions, estimated convoy speed, and projected storm duration. If calculations were wrong, the patrol would either miss the convoy entirely or drive into an ambush blind. The calculations were not wrong. The Australian vehicles emerged from the wall of dust approximately 200 meters behind the Taliban convoy at 0347 local time. The enemy drivers did not see them coming because visibility was non-existent and storm noise covered engine sounds. The first indication the convoy had that anything was wrong came when the rear vehicle simply exploded under impact of 40mm grenades from the Australian lead vehicle. What followed was less a battle than systematic elimination. The Australians had trained for exactly this scenario, engaging a linear target in conditions of zero visibility using nothing but muzzle flashes and instinct. Each vehicle knew its sector. Each gunner knew which portion of the convoy to engage. The coordination was wordless, almost mechanical, a dance of destruction choreographed through years of shared experience. The convoy consisted of 8 vehicles carrying weapons, ammunition, and approximately 30 fighters. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When the dust settled literally, the Australians had neutralized the entire convoy without taking a single casualty. The weapons cache recovered included surface-to-air missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and enough small arms to equip a battalion. But the tactical victory was only the beginning of the operation's true impact. The Taliban command structure learned about the Sandstorm engagement within days. The psychological impact was devastating. Enemy commanders had believed that weather events provided sanctuary, periods when they could move freely without fear of coalition interdiction. The Australians had proven that no sanctuary existed. Intercepted communications from weeks following the operation revealed a fundamental shift in Taliban planning. Enemy fighters began referring to the Australians using terms that translated roughly to the bearded ghosts or the devils who ride the wind. Movement during dust storms decreased dramatically. Convoy operations became more cautious, more fragmented, more vulnerable to other forms of interdiction. Every engagement sent ripples through enemy command structures that shaped behavior far beyond immediate tactical results. A captured Taliban mid-level commander interrogated in 2011 provided testimony illuminating enemy perceptions. He stated that his fighters would engage American patrols with confidence because they knew what to expect. The Americans would call for air support, establish defensive positions, and wait for reinforcement. These were responses that could be planned around, exploited, countered. The Australians were different. Engaging them meant accepting that anything could happen. They might retreat. They might attack. They might disappear and return hours later from unexpected directions. They might pursue across terrain no vehicle should traverse. The uncertainty itself was a weapon degrading enemy morale and complicating planning in ways no amount of firepower could match. But the Americans were not simply passive observers of Australian methods. They were taking notes. The U.S. Special Operations Command conducted extensive studies of SASR methods beginning in 2010. These studies resulted in changes to American training programs emphasizing elements the Australians had pioneered. Silence drills became standard for compound clearance. Vehicle tactics shifted toward lighter platforms with greater mobility. Communication protocols were modified to reduce radio chatter during sensitive operational phases. The deeper lessons proved harder to institutionalize. The Australian approach was not simply a collection of techniques. It was a culture. The willingness to operate in sandstorms came from a tradition valuing initiative over instruction. The ability to communicate without words came from unit cohesion built over years of shared deployment. The readiness to drive into ambushes came from confidence in vehicle handling skills requiring thousands of hours to develop. These elements could not be copied through doctrine changes or equipment purchases. They required fundamental shifts in how military organizations selected, trained, and retained special operations personnel. And then came November of 2020, the reckoning that shook a nation. The Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force released a report that would change everything. The Brereton report documented credible evidence that Australian Special Operations Forces had unlawfully taken the lives of 39 individuals during the Afghanistan deployment. The report described a warrior culture gone wrong, an environment where pressures of repeated deployments, frustrations of an unwinnable war, and independence that made operators effective had combined to create conditions where terrible things became possible. The Australian Defence Force response was swift and unprecedented. Entire units were disbanded, commendations were stripped, criminal investigations were launched. The nation that had taken such pride in its special operations capabilities was forced to confront the possibility that the same qualities making those capabilities formidable had also made them dangerous. This was not a uniquely Australian problem. Every nation deploying special operations forces to Afghanistan faced similar tensions between effectiveness and accountability. The Americans had their own incidents. The British had their own reckoning with allegations of unlawful conduct in Basra and Helmand. But the Australian case was distinctive because the factors making SASR operations successful were precisely the factors creating vulnerability to the darkest impulses of war. The Sandstorm operation remained classified for years. When details finally emerged through Freedom of Information requests and veteran accounts, The engagement was held up as an example of everything right about Australian special operations. The courage, the skill, the results. All pointed to an approach deserving study and emulation. But the same veterans who described tactical brilliance also described the toll. The men who drove into that storm were not the same men who drove out. Something happened in the darkness and the dust that changed how they saw the world. They had proven they could operate where others could not. They had also proven that operating in those conditions extracted costs that conventional metrics could not measure. The question that remains for military historians is whether those costs can ever be managed. The final rotation of Australian Special Operations Forces departed Afghanistan in June of 2021, weeks before the Taliban swept back into power and erased 2 decades of coalition military effort. The veterans who had fought in that country watched the collapse with emotions that defied simple description. Some felt vindication. They had always known the war was unwinnable, that political objectives were impossible, that the entire enterprise was doomed from the beginning. Some felt rage at politicians who sent them into conflict without coherent strategy, at military leaders prioritizing metrics over reality, at the Afghan government too corrupt and weak to survive without foreign support. Most felt something more complicated, a mixture of pride in accomplishments and grief for costs. Recognition that they had been part of something historically significant, even if that significance was now defined by failure. Understanding that skills they developed and things they did would mark them for the rest of their lives in ways civilians would never comprehend. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment continues to exist. It continues selecting and training operators using methods refined through decades of deployment. It continues representing one of the most capable special operations forces on the planet. But the Afghanistan experience left marks on the institution that will take generations to fully understand. The culture enabling the Sandstorm operation was the same culture requiring investigation and reform. The question facing the regiment now is whether those qualities can be preserved while establishing controls preventing their abuse, whether the dust can remain an ally without becoming a place to hide. The haboob that swept across southern Afghanistan in March of 2007 eventually dissipated as all storms do. The sand settled back to earth. The visibility returned. American commanders at Bagram emerged from operations centers to find the world had continued turning during hours they spent waiting out the weather. Somewhere in that changed landscape, 6 dust-covered vehicles were already heading back to base. The men inside were exhausted, dehydrated, covered in grit that had worked into every fold of fabric and flesh. They had driven through conditions that should have been impossible, engaged an enemy that never saw them coming, and achieved a victory that would shape Taliban behavior for years. They did not celebrate. Celebration was not part of their culture. They cleaned weapons, maintained vehicles, filed reports, and prepared for the next operation. The war would continue. The missions would continue. The dust would rise again, and when it did, they would be ready. This was what made them feared by enemies and respected by allies. This was what made them effective beyond any reasonable measure. This was also what made them dangerous in ways no one fully understood until it was too late. The dust keeps no secrets forever. Eventually, everything buried beneath it comes to the surface. The tactical brilliance of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment emerged in after-action reports and veteran testimonies. The cost of that brilliance emerged in investigations and inquiries. Both are part of the same story about what happens when you send exceptional men to fight an impossible war and give them freedom to find their own way through the storm. The bearded ghosts have left Afghanistan. The Taliban they hunted now rule the country they terrorized. The weapons they captured have been replaced many times over. The commanders they eliminated have been succeeded by new generations of fighters who know old stories only as legends. But in institutional memory of special operations forces around the world, lessons of the Australian approach endure. The dust is still an ally for those willing to use it. The storm is still an opportunity for those brave enough to enter it. And questions raised by men who drove into sandstorms while others stayed safe continue demanding answers no one has yet fully provided. The war is over. The reckoning continues. And somewhere in archives of military history, the after-action report from that March night in 2007 sits alongside thousands of others, a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept limits, and a warning about what they might become when limits disappear entirely.